People ask me, sometimes, why I filed the paperwork, not why I survived. They never ask that directly. It makes them uncomfortable, I think, the way the question assumes the answer. They ask around it. They ask what it was like, what I ate, how cold it got. They ask whether I was scared. They ask if I knew I was going to make it. I tell them the weather station had 3 intact hull foam panels. I tell them Keth-4 meat tastes like wet copper and old boot leather. I tell them it got cold enough that the moisture in my exhalations froze before it dispersed and fell as a fine powder in front of my face, and that I found this interesting rather than alarming. I tell them I did not know I was going to make it. I had a high working probability, and I kept recalculating it, but I did not know. As for why I filed the paperwork, I filed the paperwork because it was the correct thing to do, and because Vrak Hegemony territorial law is, in fact, binding, and because Subcommander Varseket's expression when the clerk handed him the stamped receipt was worth considerably more than the frostbite. I will try to put the whole thing in order. It is harder than it sounds. My memory of those 7 days is very precise, not fragmented, the way people seem to expect trauma to be, but detailed in the wrong direction, the way a long march is detailed. Not in large events, but in the specific texture of each hour, the particular quality of cold at a specific grade of slope, the exact way a piece of hull foam behaves when you press it against a seam of your clothing and breathe into it. The large events were few. The small ones were everything. I will start at the depot. The Vrak Hegemony operates 17 penal exile installations across the outer belt. Systems and Depot 7 at Veth-Kaar Station is the administrative hub for 3 of them. I had been there for 9 days before they dropped me. Processing, they called it. I had a cell with a bunk and a drain in the floor, and a single light strip that never turned off, and 3 times a day a Vrak guard slid a tray through a slot in the door. The food was edible. A compressed protein block and a fluid pack that tasted of mineral salts and something faintly organic, medicinal in a way that suggested nutritional engineering rather than anything that had grown somewhere. The light was irritating. I slept when I was tired and did calisthenics when I wasn't, and I read the cell walls, which had been scratched over with notation by previous occupants in at least 4 languages, none of which I could fully read, though one script looked like a dialect of Palathi Standard, and another looked like it might have been early Vrak administrative shorthand, which is a different animal from modern Vrak Standard. The characters are more angular, and the word order inverted in conditional constructions. I spent time on those. It gave me something to do, and it told me things about the kind of beings who had been in this cell before me, which was information. The Vrak guards were green-scaled, heavy through the chest and shoulder, with jaw plates that flared when they were agitated. They were not agitated around me. They were bored and a little contemptuous. Humans were not a common intake at Veth-Kaar. The guards who processed me made several comments to each other in their own language that I could not fully follow, but the register was clear enough. The same flat dismissiveness you hear from any enforcement caste that has decided a thing is beneath their attention. I was beneath their attention. I was a deferred administrative task in a cell, with the light always on. On the 2nd day, I asked one of the guards, through the slot in the door, whether the light could be reduced at sleep periods. He looked at me for a moment and then turned away without answering. On the 4th day, a different guard, younger, the scaling lighter at the neck, paused at the slot for slightly longer than the drop-off required. I said nothing. He left. On the 6th day, I was taken to a room with a table and 2 Vrak administrators who asked me questions in accented standard, and I answered those questions accurately and without embellishment, and they made notes and returned me to the cell, and I never learned what the notes contained. On the 9th day, they came in with a stun prod and 2 sets of cuffs and marched me down a corridor, hadn't seen before, out through a cargo bay and onto a transport shuttle. There were 3 guards and a clerk. The clerk was carrying a datapad with a long form displayed on it, and he read from it without looking up. A recitation of charges. a recitation of my sentence, a recitation of the specific designation of the world to which I was being remanded. I listened carefully. I always listen carefully. The designation was Veth-Kaar, penal classification, terminal. World classification in the Vrak registry, class 26 hostile, unsurvivable by sentient biological standards. Duration of sentence, permanent, meaning this was not transportation to a prison, this was disposal. The hegemony was not imprisoning me. It was setting me down somewhere and walking away. I said nothing. The clerk finished reading and folded the datapad and did not look at me. The guards were already done with me in their minds. The shuttle lifted. I would like to say there was a long look at the system through a viewport. Something cinematic. The two suns of the Veth-Kaar system receding in the distance. The moment where a man takes stock of what is and what is coming. There was no viewport. There was a cargo hold with a grated floor and 3 guards and a clerk and a set of restraints attached to a wall. And the flight took 4 hours and 20 minutes by my counting of minutes, which I kept as precisely as I could, with nothing but the rhythm of the shuttle's engine changes to calibrate by. And I spent most of it doing the calculations I needed to do. What I knew about Veth-Kaar, it was an ice world, high axial tilt, class 4 atmosphere, breathable, marginally, with elevated particulate content from the seismic activity in the southern volcanic belt, though the exile drop zone would almost certainly be at a northern latitude away from that. Mean surface temperature somewhere between -42 and -68 degrees standard across the habitable latitudes, considerably worse in the polar zones and considerably more variable than those numbers, suggest because ice worlds with high axial tilt have weather systems that do not behave predictably at the margins. Gravity slightly below standard, 0.91, based on the hegemony registry classification, which mattered for movement efficiency and also for snow depth in the lower channels. The Vrak designation of class 26 unsurvivable was based on their own species' thermal tolerances. Vrak are cold-blooded in the broad functional sense. They thermoregulate actively, but their metabolic baseline runs warmer than their environment, requires and cold impairs their cognition and coordination faster than heat does. A Vrak unprotected on Veth-Kaar's surface would be incapacitated within 2 hours and dead within 6. I was not Vrak. Earth, when we classified it, came out as class 26 in the Vrak registry as well. I did not know this at the time they were exiling me. I found it out later, in a footnote of the territorial dispute documentation. I mention it because it is relevant to the paperwork, and also because I found it funny in a way that is difficult to explain to people who haven't spent time thinking about what taxonomic classification systems reveal about the assumptions of the beings that built them. What I knew about human thermal tolerances, I had done a 14-month surface rotation on Heron's Belt Outpost, which runs between -30 and -50 in winter, and which is also, as I later confirmed, a class 26 in the Vrak registry. I had done a 6-week survival qualification on Denev 4, which is a volcanic glacial hybrid, and has the additional feature of being actively trying to kill you through tectonic instability and sulfur, upwelling from the lower ice shelf. I had the standard Terran Surface Division Cold Environment Package, which covers hypothermia management, improvised insulation, caloric prioritization under cold stress, ice navigation, predator encounter protocols for Class 4 atmospheres, and the specific art of keeping yourself alive when the environment's entire objective function is your dissolution. The TSD Cold Package is thorough. The instructors who wrote it had access to 700 years of accumulated human cold survival experience, including a significant amount of data from the early colonial period when people were doing exactly what I was about to do, walking across hostile terrain with inadequate equipment and working with what was available. Some of those people made it. The ones who made it generated the data that went into the manual. I was planning to add a data point, so I did the math, sitting on the grated floor of a cargo hold with my hands cuffed to a wall, and the math came out favorable. Not certain. The margin was narrow enough to matter and wide enough to work with, provided I made good decisions from the first moment of contact with the surface, and did not stop making good decisions until I was somewhere with walls and heat. I was calm. This is not a boast. It is a description of a cognitive state that has a specific cause. I was calm because I had done the calculations, and the calculations gave me something concrete to do, and something concrete to do is the antidote to most kinds of fear. The fear was there. I am not wired differently from any other human being in that way, but it was a background process, running on low priority, and the foreground was occupied with planning. When the foreground is occupied with planning, the fear does not go away, but it becomes less relevant. It is there in the way that background noise is there, present, registered, not commanding. The shuttle set down at approximately 3:30 local time, in what I estimated to be early morning, based on the sky conditions I could see when they opened the cargo door. The sky was the color of a bruise, dark violet shading into gray, with 2 moons visible, both small and pale, and a smear of lighter color on the eastern horizon that was the beginning of dawn. The air that came in was immediately, precisely cold, the specific quality of cold that has no moisture in it and cuts rather than soaks. And I felt it in my sinuses and along the back of my throat before the rest of me had registered it. It was the cold of a world that had been cold for a very long time and intended to continue. They walked me down the ramp, 1 guard in front, 1 behind, the clerk to the side, the 3rd guard staying at the shuttle. The surface underfoot was packed snow over hard ice, and it squeaked under their boots in the way that very cold, very dry snow does. The sound was familiar from Heron's belt. The fact of its familiarity was useful data. They took my cuffs off, not out of courtesy, I noted, but because the cuffs were hegemony property and they wanted them back. The clerk detached a secondary data pad from his belt and made me press my thumb to it. I pressed my thumb to it. He confirmed the print, made a notation, checked something on his main pad, and then the 3 of them walked back up the ramp without another word. No speech, no final statement. They had done the administrative task, and the task was complete, as far as they were concerned. The shuttle lifted. I watched it go. Not for sentiment. I am not describing a moment of desolation, though I suppose someone with less to think about might have felt one. I was watching the engine wash disturb the snow and charting which direction the disturbance tracked, because the disturbance pattern tells you something about the predominant wind direction. And wind direction is a navigation input. The shuttle climbed out of sight in roughly a minute. The sound of it persisted for another 2 minutes, and then that was also gone. And the silence that came after was the most thorough silence I have ever been in. Not the silence of a quiet room, which still has the texture of walls and ventilation systems, and the small sounds of enclosed space, but the silence of a world that does not produce incidental noise at this temperature. At -50, the ice does not creak. The atmosphere does not carry insect sound. The wind, when it was not blowing, left behind something that was not quite silence and not quite sound, more like the felt absence of the small continuous noise that living environments generate. I found it very clear. My thinking felt clean in it. I took stock, what I had, a set of TSD fatigues, 4 layers, base through outer shell with thermal interlining in the mid-layers, good to approximately -30, sustained before the thermal deficit starts to compound in extended operations. A pair of boots rated to -40, somewhat less if I was going to be on my feet for sustained periods without shelter and caloric support. The rating assumes reasonable rest cycles and adequate caloric intake, neither of which were guaranteed. A belt, which had a knife on it. A standard utility blade, 11 centimeters. Not a survival knife, but a knife, which is a categorically different item from nothing. A field medical kit sewn into the left forearm of the shell layer, basic. 4 compressed bandages, a tube of antiseptic gel, a roll of medical tape, 2 doses of broad-spectrum antibiotic calibrated for human biology. No radio, no beacon, no ration pack, no water purification beyond what my body could do with snow. What I needed to do in order of priority: find or make shelter before my core temperature began reading the exposure, which at these temperatures and my current clothing configuration, I estimated at roughly 3 hours to the onset of early-stage hypothermia. If remained stationary, establish a reliable water source, which meant managed snow intake, because standing water on an ice world at this temperature would be under the ice and inaccessible. Find calories. Assess the terrain for navigation to the only piece of infrastructure that offered any prospect of leaving this planet. What I did not need to do: panic, run, or make decisions faster than the situation required. Fast decisions made in inadequate information conditions are how people die in cold environments. You die because you ran and sweated through your insulation, and then stopped and had wet insulation next to your skin instead of dry. You die because you chose the wrong direction and added kilometers to a walk you couldn't afford to extend. You die because you burned through the energy you needed to stay alive in the next hour, trying to solve the next 6 hours. Cold survival is not an emergency response. It is a sequence of small, correct decisions made in a specific order at the pace the situation requires, not the pace that fear suggests. I moved east into the wind shadow. The first shelter was not something I built. It was something I found. And I want to be clear about this, because it is the kind of thing that sounds like luck, but is not entirely luck. I moved in the direction the dawn was coming from, which was east, because east was also slightly downslope. And downslope in an ice waste means moving away from the ridge lines that generate the worst wind toward the lower ground, where both temperature and exposure are marginally better managed. Moving toward lower ground in the direction of dawn also meant this was inference, not certainty, but it was reasoned inference, moving toward the lower elevations where any alien infrastructure on this world would most likely sit, because nobody builds infrastructure at altitude in an ice waste if they have a choice. They build at the lowest viable elevation. I was making educated decisions. I was not guessing. There is a difference, and it matters. And the difference is what the 700 years of accumulated data in the TSD manual is about. I walked for 40 minutes through terrain that was flat ice over rock shelf, the snow packed to maybe 10 centimeters over the granite, the footing solid and even. My feet were fine at 40 minutes. My hands were beginning to feel the sustained cold. My gloves were liner gloves, part of the standard kit, not rated for extended exposure, designed to keep your hands comfortable at temperatures I was now well below. I put them inside my outer shell pockets against my torso and kept walking with my arms crossed and my hands in contact with my own warmth. This is not comfortable. It is correct. The weather station appeared first as a shadow against the lighter sky, and then as a structure against the snow, and then as a specific kind of structure. A Vrak portable atmospheric monitoring installation, the kind they anchor to a rock shelf with ground bolts in sets of 6. It was partially collapsed. The anchor bolts on the northern side had pulled free. I could see the torn bracket points in the rock shelf, the bolts still attached to the structural base on the station's underside, which meant the failure had been in the rock rather than the bolts. A geological event of some kind, or possibly simple freeze-thaw cycling over many seasons working at the anchor points until the rock sheared. That half of the structure had fallen and half buried itself in the accumulated snow, which meant the southern half was canted at a 40-degree angle, which meant there was a wedge-shaped space between the canted wall and the rock shelf that was sheltered from wind on 3 sides. I crawled into the wedge. The ground was bare rock. The overhanging structure had prevented snow accumulation, and the temperature was still extremely cold, but the wind dropped to nothing. I sat with my back against the rock and my front toward the canted wall and pulled my knees in and let my body begin to heat the small space. The collapsed structure had hull foam, standard Vrak construction insulating polymer, a cellular material about 2 centimeters thick that comes in panels roughly a meter square. It is not a good thermal insulator by engineered standards. It is substantially better than nothing, which is the relevant comparison. 2 panels had buckled when the structure collapsed and were partially accessible from my position inside the wedge. One was resting against the inside of the canted wall at an angle I could reach. One had separated from its bonded seam and was lying on the rock shelf outside the wedge entrance, which I pulled in. It took 11 minutes to free both of them. Freeing the first one split one of my fingernails at the base where I had been using it as a pry point, which I sealed with medical tape before it could complicate things. A torn nail base in a cold environment will catch cold and begin to cause disproportionate problems within a day or two if not managed. I had 2 hull foam panels and a small enclosed space. I arranged myself so the panels were in front and above me, closing off the open sides of the wedge, and sat with my back against the rock and let my body heat the contained air. It was a slow process. It worked. By the time full light came, the 2 suns here were both small and white, cold light in the photometric sense, giving visibility without meaningful infrared warmth, not like a yellow star, more like light that does what light does without the associated temperature. I was no longer losing core temperature. I was maintaining. That was sufficient for the moment. I ate snow, slowly in small amounts, rolling it in my mouth until it melted before swallowing. Eating snow in volume drops your core temperature faster than the hydration benefit offsets. The energy cost of melting the snow comes from your metabolic heat budget, and at -50 with inadequate caloric input, that budget is not generous. But I needed hydration, and the snow was present, and small amounts managed carefully were the correct solution. I needed calories more urgently. Snow does not have calories. The TSD nutrition module covers the timeline precisely. Under cold stress without caloric input, a human being begins meaningful metabolic deficit at approximately 16 hours. I was at roughly 9 hours since my last meal, which had been the compressed protein block in the cell. I had a window. The window would close. I slept for 3 hours in the shelter, which I did not want to do and which was necessary. Sleep is not a luxury under cold stress. It is a metabolic priority. A fatigued body in cold manages its thermoregulation less efficiently, makes slower decisions, misses pattern data that a rested brain would catch. I set myself against the possibility of sleeping too long. I positioned the loose hull foam panel so that it rested against the wedge opening at a balance that would fall if the wind shifted and changed the pressure dynamics on it, and the sound of it falling would wake me. It fell once, for a wind shift that passed, and I reset it and went back to sleep. The third time I came fully awake, it was not the panel. The Veth-Kaar do not make a loud sound on approach. This is their primary adaptive advantage as a pack hunter. And once I had spent time with them, I found it a genuinely elegant piece of evolutionary engineering. They use subsonic vibration in addition to their more audible vocalizations, and the subsonic component travels through the ice shelf and the rock below it. And what I felt was not a sound but a change in pressure, a tightening in the small enclosed space, something the body registers before the conscious mind categorizes it. I was awake and had the knife out before I had fully identified what had woken me, 3 of them at the entrance to the wedge. I want to be accurate about this rather than dramatic. They were not immediately attacking. They were assessing. I was a new biological presence in their territory. New smell, new sounds, the particular stillness of a thing that has made itself a shelter rather than moving through the terrain. Apex predators with pack intelligence do not charge everything that appears in their range. They assess, they weight the risk, they make a decision. The assessment was what I was watching. I did not wait for the decision. I moved out of the wedge, which reversed the dynamic. I was no longer cornered. I was choosing the ground. And the choice of ground matters in a close encounter with animals that use surround tactics. I came out fast and low, to the right of the central animal, which forced it to turn to track me rather than having me in front of it. And the one on the right side adjusted, and the one on the left was slightly slow, and I took the one that was slightly slow. The blade is 11 centimeters, and not designed for this work. And I will not pretend the next 2 minutes were clean. They were not. The Kethvor on the left died. The other two withdrew, not in panic, in the considered retreat of animals that have encountered resistance beyond the expected range and are updating their model of what I was. They went back perhaps 12 meters and sat on the ice and watched me. I let them watch. I was busy. The dead Kethvor was a significant resource. This is a clinical way to describe something that was also physically demanding and not pleasant, but clinical is accurate. Calories, in the form of fat and protein. Insulation, in the form of the pelt, which once separated from the subcutaneous tissue layer and turned outside and retains heat reasonably well as a supplemental wrap. And information. The animal's anatomy told me things about Veth-Kaar's biology. What apex predator biology looks like here. What the prey base must look like to support something of this mass and this metabolic profile. I filed it all. Information has a way of becoming useful before you expect it to. The raw protein was the calculated risk. Under cold stress, the caloric need is immediate, and the risk of gastrointestinal distress from raw meat is real but not certain, and certain starvation rates worse than possible distress. I ate what I needed. My body handled it. I think this is something the Hegemony's Class 26 assessors genuinely did not account for. Not just human thermal resilience, but the specific breadth of what the human digestive system has evolved to process. We ate a lot of things for a very long time, in a very wide range of conditions. The range is wider than most species expect. The two surviving Kethvor watched me work and then left, moving north at an unhurried pace. I did not know if they were going to return with more of the pack. I assumed they might, which was the correct assumption, and which affected my timeline for leaving the shelter. I repacked what I could carry. The pelt, folded and wrapped inside the outer shell layer that I could manage without. A portion of the fat packed in the medical kit pouch to supplement later. The hull foam panels strapped against my torso under the shell layer for insulation during movement. I ate a measured portion. I drank managed snow. I resealed the fingernail tape. Then I picked up my heading and walked north-northwest. What I am about to describe as 7 days is actually 167 hours and some minutes, which I counted as precisely as I could maintain, using the dual sun track as my time reference. The sun's arc across Veth-Kaar's sky is fixed. It does not vary with magnetic conditions or weather. And by the 3rd day, I had the arc committed, well enough to estimate the hour within about 40 minutes, which is sufficient for operational planning. The first full day of walking was the hardest because it was the day of not knowing. Every piece of information I had about the terrain was new, being processed in real time, nothing yet confirmed by repetition. I did not know how the snow surface was going to behave at the transition from flat shelf to slope terrain. I did not know how the Kethvor range was distributed, whether the pack I had encountered was at the edge of their territory or the center of it. I did not know whether the weather patterns I was seeing were typical or anomalous. I was reading and reading and reading, and everything I read was a first reading. By the end of the first day, I had a working model of Veth-Kaar's immediate behavior. The snow surface changes color at the approach of a significant wind event. Not dramatically, but enough to see if you know to look for it. The zone downwind of a rock formation collects different snow than the open surface, and the different snow has a slightly warmer color, yellowed, from the mineral dust the formation sheds. Ice that will support a human body has a specific resonance when you tap it, and a specific color in daylight, harder, lighter, with an almost blue tint in the depths. Ice that will not support a human body sounds hollow and reads darker. These are not secrets. These are patterns, and patterns are what the brain evolved to find, and the human brain finds them faster than most other brains I am aware of, given sufficient exposure and sufficient survival pressure. By the end of the 2nd day, the terrain felt legible. I want to try to describe this because it is the thing people most often fail to understand when I recount this experience. There is a transition that happens in sustained, hostile environment work, It happens on every long-duration posting I have done, though the timeline varies, where the environment stops being the thing that is working against you and becomes the place you have learned to live inside. The conditions do not change. Your relationship to them does. The cold is the same cold, but now it is cold that you know the specific behavior of at each phase of the day. The wind pattern that drops at the 3rd hour after local noon is something you plan around rather than react to. The subsonic vibration in the ice shelf that means a Veth-Kaar is within a certain range becomes background information rather than emergency data. I am not describing adaptation in the romantic sense. I am describing what pattern recognition does when it has accumulated sufficient input. The human brain is a prediction machine. It builds models. In a stable enough environment, even a hostile one, the models converge on accuracy. And once the models are accurate, the cognitive overhead of survival drops, and you have capacity for higher order work. The higher order work, in this case, was navigation and planning. I had the terrain. I could use the terrain. On the 3rd day, I killed the 2nd Veth-Kaar. This one was alone, moving in parallel to my path at a distance of perhaps 15 meters and gradually angling to intercept. A young male, from its size, lighter boned than the 3 I had encountered at the shelter, the pelt less full. It was using what I recognize now as the pack's standard intercept behavior, angling ahead of my direction of travel so that the interception point was in front of me rather than at my side. I had seen this tactic from the first pack. I understood it now. I changed direction twice in succession to confirm the intercept was intentional and not coincidental movement. It was intentional. The animal adjusted both times, maintaining the intercept angle. When I was certain, I stopped walking entirely and stood still. The Veth-Kaar that is hunting you expects you to keep moving. The intercept tactic is calibrated to prey movement. The predator's position ahead of the prey's direction of travel is only an advantage if the prey continues moving in that direction. When the prey stops, the predator must come to the prey, which is a different geometry, a less favorable one. There was a pause. The animal held its position, then began to move toward me rather than ahead of me, which was the correct predator response, but which meant it was now on my terms rather than its own. I led it close to 4 meters and then moved. I had more calories. I was carrying what I could use and left the rest under a snow cache, triangulated off a distinctive granite spire to the east-southeast and the angle of the late sun position. I did not need to return to the cache, but I knew where it was. The 3rd and 4th days were the middle days. The days that, in retrospect, look like the unremarkable core of the experience, though they did not feel unremarkable while I was in them. They felt like work. They felt like the specific sustained quality of attention that long-duration field operations require, where you are never fully relaxed and never fully alarmed, where you are simply running at a steady operational temperature, assessing continuously, deciding continuously, moving. I built a snowblock windbreak on the evening of the 3rd day, 37 minutes to construct. The hull foam panels as a ceiling sealed with packed snow at the seams, and the interior temperature was 11 to 12 degrees warmer than the exterior, which was the difference between thermal maintenance and slow attrition. I was eating adequately. I was hydrating adequately. My frostbite risk was highest at my extremities. I was monitoring my fingers and toes at every rest stop, doing circulation checks, adjusting my hand positioning to keep the fingers re-warm cycling against my torso. The 1st and 2nd fingers of my right hand were showing early-stage surface frostbite by the end of the 3rd day, which I expected and was managing. The 3rd finger was a concern. On the 4th day, the magnetic storm came in from the north. Veth-Kaar's magnetic field is unstable at these latitudes due to the high ferrous content in the upper mantle and the complex field geometry that this creates, with local anomalies that shift with the seismic activity in the southern volcanic belt. A magnetic storm event on Veth-Kaar is not like a geomagnetic storm on a stable world. It is a full field disturbance that produces visible auroral activity at lower latitudes and, relevant to me, ionizes enough of the lower atmosphere to affect my improvised compass. I had been navigating with my knife blade magnetized against my belt buckle and suspended on a thread of medical tape, standard improvised compass, less accurate than a real one, but sufficient for general heading maintenance. During the peak of the storm, the blade spun rather than held. I navigated by solar azimuth instead. The two suns of the Veth-Kaar system track in a fixed arc. I had spent 3 days watching that arc. I knew the azimuth of each sun at each of the 7 major phases of the local day, with sufficient precision to maintain a heading within about 10 degrees, which over the distances I was covering translated to an acceptable positional error. The storm lasted 19 hours. I walked for 14 of them, taking the rest in a shelter I dug into a snowbank on the north side of a granite shelf. An ice cave, essentially, with a narrow entrance to retain heat and an airway hole to prevent CO2 buildup, which is a risk that people who have not done cold environment work sometimes forget about. I woke once at an unusual sound, assessed, identified it as a seismic event at a distance, the volcanic belt, minor, and went back to sleep. I came out of the storm with my heading intact and 23 kilometers covered. On the 5th day, I found the frozen lake. The lake appeared suddenly. I crested a slope, and the terrain dropped away into a flat white expanse that stretched east and west as far as I could see clearly, approximately 4 kilometers across at the narrowest point, running roughly east-west. And it was between me and my target heading. Going around, it would add 7 to 10 kilometers depending on the approach angle. Going across it required an assessment of ice thickness at this specific location, at this specific season. Standard ice crossing protocol. In stages, starting at the margin, checking thickness by the resonance of a sharp impact against the surface. Reading the ice color. Dark means thinner or subsurface current. Light blue means solid and thick, checking for pressure ridges which indicate stress zones, and advancing only as the testing confirms. The ice at the southern margin where I approached was approximately 40 centimeters, confirmed by testing at 3 points. The ice in the center zone read visually darker, indicating either shallower formation depth or a subsurface flow. I plotted a crossing line that arced northwest around the darker zone, staying on the confirmed solid ice, and tested every 12 steps during the crossing. 40 minutes to cross. The ice held. On the north shore, there were Vrak boot tracks. The hexagonal tread of Hegemony field boots is distinctive. The pattern is the same across all Hegemony military and security applications, which is a standardization choice that reflects the Vrak preference for administrative coherence over operational security. There were 6 sets of tracks moving east, recently enough that the wind had not yet begun to fill them in, 3 to 4 hours old, I estimated, given the wind conditions I had been tracking all day. They were evenly spaced and maintained a consistent line, which said patrol rather than exploration. A patrol has a start point and an end point. They were moving east. Their start point was west. I followed the tracks west. I found the depot from high ground on the 6th day, 9 kilometers out. After an overnight shelter in a natural rock overhang on the reverse slope of the ridge I had used for observation, the depot was larger than I had estimated from the shuttle's approach vector. 3 pressurized main structures, a landing pad with 2 craft on it, 4 atmospheric processors visible by their exhaust columns, and a perimeter of monitoring equipment that I spent several hours studying through the conditions I had available, which were limited but informative. The monitoring coverage was heaviest on the southern and western approaches, which is where any traffic from the shuttle drop zones would come from. The northern approach, where I was, had a single passive monitoring post and a patrol track. Nothing was supposed to be coming from the north. I observed through the 6th day and most of the 6th night. I counted the patrol cycles, a pair of guards, the hexagonal boot tread pattern, moving east from the installation's north perimeter gate and returning roughly 90 minutes later. The cycle repeated with reasonable regularity, allowing for the patrol's own discretion. The gap between cycles was enough for my purposes. I ate the last of what I was carrying, slept for 6 hours, and was moving before the local dawn on the 7th day. I want to be clear about what I did on the morning of the 7th day, because there is sometimes a misunderstanding about what it means to walk into a Vrak installation under these circumstances. People hear the story and they imagine a dramatic entry, a confrontation, something that builds to a visible climax. It was not that. It was a logistical problem with a specific solution, and I solved it the way I had solved every other problem over the preceding 7 days by identifying the variables, ordering them by priority, and acting on them in sequence. The logistical problem. I needed to reach the interior of the installation without triggering a lethal response from guards who would not initially understand what they were seeing. A human on foot approaching from the north across a world the hegemony had classified as unsurvivable after 7 days of exposure was a category error in their operational model. This is not an insult to their intelligence. It is a description of what it means when your classification system does not include the class of event that is currently occurring. They had no framework for this, which meant the first several seconds of any contact would be confusion rather than response. And confusion is time. And time was what I needed to get close enough to the main entrance to be visibly inside the installation's administrative space before any guard made a decision. I had the Veth-Kaar pelt over my shoulders, which I want to note for accuracy, not as a dramatic detail, but because it was a real factor. I was wearing alien predator fur on a world that was supposed to have killed me, walking out of the approach that should have been empty, visibly damaged but visibly moving, and the combination of these things produced in the guards I encountered a specific cognitive stall that I had anticipated and planned for. The Vrak do not, as a behavioral tendency, apply lethal response to something that is clearly already catastrophically damaged and still ambulatory. They are a law and order culture. They want to process the situation. The processing instinct was what I was counting on. The first guard saw me from about 40 meters. He stopped moving. The jaw plates flared, the agitation reflex. And then, after 2 seconds, went still, which is the Vrak version of the conscious override, when the threat response gets suppressed in favor of attempting to categorize the anomaly. He was trying to figure out what he was looking at. I kept walking. The second guard came out of the gatehouse when the first one made a sound, a low, resonant sound I had not heard Vrak make before, something between a warning and a summons, and the second guard came to the threshold and also stopped. 2 guards, 12 meters apart, stationary, both watching me. Nothing else moved. I walked up to the nearer one and stopped at a distance that was close enough to make the conversation conversational but not close enough to register as a threat. I said, in Vrak standard, that I was Sergeant Kael Doss, Terran Surface Division, that I had been transported to this world under hegemony penal authority 9 days prior and had been on the surface for 7, and that I required access to a communications terminal, a medical assessment for frostbite of the right hand, and the duty clerk. They looked at each other. I said I would wait. They made me wait in the gatehouse. This was the correct call on their part. Remove the anomaly from the open space, contain it, alert the chain of command, assess. I sat on the bench they indicated and held my right hand carefully. The 3 affected fingers needed managed rewarm, not rapid rewarm, and the gatehouse temperature was warm enough to start the process if I was careful about it. I pulled the hand inside my shell layer against my chest and let the temperature differential do the work slowly. I had the medical tape ready for the final wrap. The gatehouse was warm. I had been cold for 7 days. I am going to say that again because I think it is important. I had been cold for 7 days, not acutely cold. Not the kind of cold that kills you in an hour, but the sustained cold of a world that is always trying to take your heat away. The kind of cold that you live inside of and manage continuously and never fully escape. And the warmth of the gatehouse was the most significant physical sensation I had experienced in the previous 167 hours. I sat on the bench and managed my fingers and did not show that the warmth mattered to me. This was not dissembling. It was procedure. The temperature of the room was information I could use, and I was using it. And that function occupied the same cognitive space that reaction would have occupied. Sub-Commander Varseket came in approximately 12 minutes after the guards had summoned the chain of command. He was large, even for a Vrak, chest-heavy, the jaw plates more pronounced than the guards, the green scaling darker at the shoulders and neck in the way that indicates a mature male of high rank in their physiology. He had 2 additional guards with him, and he was carrying a data pad that was clearly displaying my intake file. I could see the hegemony processing header from across the room, the specific layout that the penal assignment forms use. He looked at the file and then looked at me, and then looked at the file again, and the jaw plates went through 3 configurations in quick succession. He said, in Vrak Standard, that my sentence record indicated I had been remanded to this world 9 days ago, that the world in question was Class 26 unsurvivable, that no individual of any species, to his personal knowledge, and consistent with all operational records of this installation, had previously survived more than 14 hours on the surface without environmental protection rated to Class 20 or above. I said that I was aware of the record and that I had now been on the surface for 167 hours, and that this seemed like the kind of information that should be reflected in the administrative file. He was silent for a moment. I said that I also wanted to report an active Kethvor predator territory approximately 18 kilometers south-southwest. Minimum pack size of 4 individuals based on my direct contact, with a range that extended north to the lakeshore and east to the Granite Ridge system. I noted that their intercept behavior was consistent, and that the Hegemony's standard surface operations protocol for Class 26 worlds might want to flag it for any future patrols operating in that sector. As a courtesy, his jaw plates moved. The 2 additional guards were very still. I asked if there was somewhere I could get hot water. They took me to the medical station. The Vrak medical technician was young, lighter scaled at the neck, and was visibly working through the same categorical difficulty the guards had displayed. What protocols applied to this situation were not ones that had been used in living memory possibly ever at this installation. He assessed my frostbite without asking unnecessary questions, which I appreciated. 1st degree on 2 fingers, a borderline 2nd degree progression on the 3rd that had not yet reached the deep tissue. He applied a Vrak thermal regeneration compound, a gel-based treatment that initiates controlled rewarm through a heat-generating chemical reaction in the dermis layer. It was the most immediately effective physical relief I had experienced in 7 days, and I sat in the examination chair and let it work, and drank the hot water they brought me, which tasted of mineral processing and was, in every way that mattered, excellent. While the technician worked, I asked for a communications terminal and the duty clerk. Varseket authorized it. I believe he authorized it because he was in the early stages of understanding what he was looking at, and his instinct was to give me what I asked for in order to keep the situation stable while he worked out what it meant. This is a reasonable instinct. I would have made the same call. When you are confronting a categorical anomaly, you manage it before you respond to it. And the way you manage it is by not escalating until you know what you are escalating against. The communications room was small. The duty clerk, younger even than the technician, the lightest scaled Vrak I had seen in this installation, brought in a chair and stood at the edge of the room with the expression of someone doing their professional best to treat the situation as normal. I respected this. Normal is a useful operational stance when normal has stopped applying. I sent 2 messages. The first was to Terran Surface Division Command at the relay station, which was 12 hours away at best transmission speed. This was the notification that protocol required. I was alive. I was at the depot. I needed extraction authorization. The message was brief and factual and contained no language that would require explanation. The second message was to the Vrak Hegemony Territorial Registry Authority. The Vrak Hegemony Territorial Charter has a provision, Section 14, Article 7, the Habitable Claim Provision, that dates from the early expansion period, 240 years ago, when the hegemony was engaged in active territorial disputes with 3 other regional powers over the classification of marginal worlds. The provision holds that a world designated uninhabitable by hegemony classification standards may be claimed as habitable by any registered sentient entity that can demonstrate sustained unprotected survival on the surface for a period of no less than 72 standard hours. The intent was clear when it was written. Hegemony colonists demonstrating survival on worlds their competitors had designated uninhabitable could legally challenge that designation and file a counterclaim. It had not been invoked in approximately 240 years because the relevant disputes had been settled and nothing had come up since that required it. The provision does not specify that the claim must be filed against a non-hegemony classification. It does not specify that the claimant must be in dispute with a competing power. It specifies the conditions: an uninhabitable designation, a registered sentient entity, 72 hours of demonstrated surface survival without environmental protection. I had been on the surface for 167 hours. The 72-hour threshold was 14.7% of my total surface time. The conditions were met with a substantial margin. I filed the claim to the Territorial Registry under Terran Provisional Authority, citing Section 14, Article 7, and attaching as supporting documentation the time-stamped record of my intake processing at Depot 7 and my return, presentation to the installation, with the gate log timestamp that the guards had generated when they received me. The duration was in the administrative record. I had not manufactured it. I had simply lived it, and the record reflected what had happened. I noted in the filing that I was available for any required attestation proceedings and that I could be reached through Terran Surface Division, command at the relay station. I asked the duty clerk to confirm the transmission had sent. He confirmed it, reading the transmission log slowly, and the expression on his face had changed. He had understood the second message. He was young, but he was the duty clerk, which means he knew the charter, and he had just read a Section 14, Article 7 filing go through his terminal, and he was now sitting with the knowledge of what that meant. I asked him for a blanket. He brought me a blanket. I was wrapped in the blanket in the communications chair when Vrak came back. He had a different data pad. He had clearly been doing research, rapid research, the kind you do when something has just happened that requires you to understand the legal framework before the other party understands it better than you do. He stood in the doorway with the jaw plates in a configuration I had not seen before and looked at me for a moment before speaking. He said, "The habitable claim provision requires the claimant to be a registered sentient entity operating under the authority of a recognized polity," I said. Terran authority is listed in Hegemony Registry Article 2, Subsection 9, as a provisional registered polity since the Veth-Kaar system accords signed 11 standard years prior. He said, "The provision was designed to contest designations applied by competing powers, not for claims against the hegemony's own classifications." I said, "The provision does not contain that restriction in its text, and intent cannot override text in hegemony charter law without a supplementary ruling from the high regulatory body." I cited the article. He said nothing for a moment. I said that I was not angry about the exile. I understood that there were charges on record and that the hegemony had exercised its authority in the manner it considered appropriate. I was not disputing the authority or challenging the process. I was simply noting that the outcome of the exercise of that authority had produced certain legal consequences that were now in the Territorial Registry and would proceed through the established review process. I said this without heat, because I did not feel heat. I felt the particular quality of calm that comes after a long march when you have reached the destination and the calculations are behind you, and the only remaining task is is the paperwork. The paperwork was already filed. The conversation we were having now was informational. Vrak looked at me for a long time. His jaw plates were very still. I asked if my medical assessment was complete enough to move to a holding room. Because the chair was adequate, but a bunk would be better. And I had been effectively awake for over 20 hours. He had me moved to a holding room. It had a bunk and a drain in the floor, and a light strip that stayed on. And this time I did not find the light irritating. I found it warm. I was asleep in 4 minutes. The registry response came 31 days later, which was not the standard 60-day review period, which tells you something about how the Hegemony's legal division viewed the filing. I was not on Veth-Kaar by then. TSD had dispatched extraction within the 12-hour relay window, and I had spent the intervening time at a Terran medical facility, and then in a series of debriefing rooms that were comfortable and well lit, and where the food was excellent and the people asking questions were thorough and professional, and I answered everything they asked with as much detail as they wanted, which was considerable. The registry response was 3 pages. The first page was a procedural acknowledgement. The second page was the Hegemony's legal argument for why the claim should not be recognized. Competent work. The argument turned primarily on intent rather than text. The position that the provision was designed for a specific historical context that no longer applied. Intent arguments are valid in some legal frameworks. In the Hegemony's own charter law, intent is not enforceable without a supplementary ruling from the high regulatory body, and the second page itself acknowledged that this ruling had been referred for but not yet obtained. The third page was a notice that the matter had been referred to the high regulatory body for final determination, and that Veth-Kaar would be held in administrative suspension pending that determination. Administrative suspension means no hegemony extraction operations, no exile processing, no infrastructure development on the world until the regulatory body issues a ruling. It also means that the 17 penal exile installations across the Outer Belt systems have a procedural complication with their Class 26 designations, because if one Class 26 world can be successfully claimed under Section 14, Article 7 by a human being with 11 centimeters of blade and TSD fatigues, then the question of which other Class 26 worlds might be similarly claimable is now an open question on the regulatory body's desk. I did not design this outcome. It followed from the correct application of existing law to a situation the law's authors did not anticipate because they did not have the Terran data. The regulatory body's ruling, as of the last time I checked, is still pending. I filed the paperwork because it was the correct thing to do. I want to be clear about this, not because I think anyone will misunderstand the motivation, but because I think the distinction matters. I did not file it out of anger. I was not angry. I was never angry, not during the exile, not during the 7 days on the surface, not in the gatehouse or the medical station or the communications room. Anger is a hot register response, and everything about those 7 days had been cold register work, the kind of work where the quality of the decision matters more than the emotional state generating it. The filing was the last decision in a sequence that had started when the shuttle lifted from the drop zone on the first morning. It was the correct decision in the sequence. I made it. People still ask me sometimes whether I would go back. I tell them Veth-Kaar in the right season is not a bad world. The suns are small, but they give good visibility. The Kethvor are manageable once you understand their tactics. The ice has a specific quality to it, a hardness, a density, that is different from any ice I have been on before, almost as if the planet is made of a single, continuous material from the surface down to wherever the ferrous core begins, everything compressed and clarified by extreme cold over an extremely long time. The silence, when the wind is not blowing, is the most complete silence I have encountered anywhere. On the morning of the 6th day, before I moved to the high ground for observation, I stood on the ice on the north shore of the frozen lake and watched the 2 suns come up together, both of them at once, one slightly higher than the other. The light coming across the ice, flat and white and absolutely clean. And everything was still, and I was cold, and I knew exactly how cold I was, and exactly what that meant, and exactly what to do about it. It was a good morning. I logged it in my field notes alongside the ice thickness readings and the wind direction data and the patrol cycle estimates, and then I climbed to the high ground and started counting. The paperwork followed naturally from that. It usually does, once you have done the work correctly.